Now, when it comes to money, as opposed to a conduct violation, we're looking at arbitration.
And probably the most frequent form of arbitration comes in disputes between cooperating brokers over who was the proximate cause.
So who was the procuring cause? That's a major issue. It's a rather complex issue, John, as we know from hearing panel to hearing panel, unfortunately, or across the country, we've heard the same facts ruled upon differently. So it is very interesting as we start to look at procuring cause.
Well, let's just define it so that we can get a feel for it. It's defined as the proximate cause, the cause originating a series of events which, without break in their continuity, result in the accomplishment of the prime objective. The inducing cause, the direct or proximate cause, substantially synonymous with the efficient cause. The initiation of an unbroken chain of causal events that results in a successful transaction. It has to result in a successful transaction, one that actually, closed.
So there's a couple of keys here, I think, John. The first key is this term, unbroken chain of events. And so whenever we're talking procuring cause, we're always looking at first this unbroken chain of events. And the second point you mentioned, if there's no deal, if there's no closing, if there's no compensation, you're not going to be able to arbitrate.
Right. There's a lot of factors that that are involved, but probably one of the most important ones, remember, arbitrations are based on contractual disputes, and it's very important to first establish the contract. In other words, was there ever an offer to compensate? Because if there was never any offer to compensate, just because the fact that somebody showed a buyer a property
doesn't mean they're entitled to anything.
Doesn't mean they're entitled to any commission. Where you see this a lot is with new project sales, where the developer, for example, might spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on advertising, trying to get buyers into their new project. And they've decided to spend their money there rather than spend the money cooperating where they're paying outside brokers to bring in their buyers. So when an outside broker comes in with a buyer and says, well, here I am, and they say, I'm not going to pay you anything, and they say, wait a minute, I'm the procuring cause.
Doesn't matter. You're procuring cause on an issue where there's no compensation being paid.
So the first thing is to find out, is there an underlying offer of compensation, usually, as you know, through the multiple listing service.
So let's go over the key points of procuring cause.
Okay, some common misconceptions here. Some people think, well, I showed the buyer the property first.
Oh, that's a bad one.
I carried the buyer across the threshold. Therefore, that buyer is mine.
I ran the ad in the newspaper. The buyer saw it there. I don't care that they bought it from you. They first saw my ad. Therefore, I was the proximate cause. I was the procuring cause, and I'm entitled to a piece, if not all, of that commission.
It's a very common claim. A person shows the buyer one property. 3 months later, they find out that this buyer is buying another property after working with another agent showing 36 properties, and the first one says, sorry, that's my buyer.
I showed him that house 3 months ago.
And they don't have any exclusive agreement. I don't have much sympathy for him. Likewise, on the other side, it doesn't necessarily always follow that if you were there to write up the contract that you are the procuring cause.
You showed the property, but I'm the one that got the contract signed. So since I got the contract signed, I'm entitled to the commission. No?
Not necessarily. This is up to the panel. They have to examine numerous factors. In this manual that we've talked about, there is a section on procuring cause. There are over 100 questions in there that a procuring cause panel might ask. Who introduced the buyer to the property? Who followed through? Who was the motivating factor? A lot of issues that vary from case to case.
You make a good point here when you mention the manual, John, the arbitration manual, the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual itself. Why don't you give us a look at that?
Well, this
is a great publication.
This is the manual, and as you can see, rather voluminous, but excellent material, all of those standards of practice, all of those case interpretations.
Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual. Is it available on the web?
Through one realtor place, you'll be able to get it free, downloaded, all of the articles, all of the standards of practice. And very important, there is a Part 4, Section 10, which is devoted to guidelines for procuring cause.
Well, let's go. Let's jump back into procuring cause. no association can establish a predetermined rule. So if my association said, look, here's the rule, whoever writes the contract gets the commission.
That would run into a problem.
That wouldn't work.
Wouldn't work. You couldn't have an association setting a rule as to entitlement to money.
Who decides who gets paid?
Ultimately, it's going to be the arbitration panel who is going to make that decision. After hearing all of the facts from all of the parties, weighing it all, they'll come up to find out the person or the firm that they think actually performed the actions that resulted in a sale. Now, an interesting thing here is there are a lot of factors that might be looked at in which somebody might have worked with the buyer initially but then abandoned the buyer.
Abandonment, that's a term you see frequently with procuring cause.
Right, you have somebody who's really good at showing but then doesn't follow up with going to help get the mortgage financing, doesn't pursue it, says, well, if they eventually buy, since
I showed them the property.
They're probably going to lose to the issue of
So showing the property is not necessarily grounds for, not enough, is it?
Not enough, but it is a factor. Whoever showed them the property first, that's a very helpful factor. You might have other situations where a buyer, after a while working with a particular broker, feels that that broker is not doing adequate job, adequate service.
Oh, so they've worked with a broker, they've worked for a month, the broker showed them everything all over town, but the person doesn't feel that they're being represented or the broker's not acting in their best interest. They can actually say, I'm cutting you loose and I don't think you're entitled to anything. That broker still might feel they are.
And as a result of feeling that way, they might decide to file for procuring cause arbitration after the other broker, who's now working with the buyer, completes the particular transaction. Then the issue becomes, too, whether there was what we call estrangement, which basically is where the client terminates any type of agency. And this is where I advise brokers who are working with a buyer to first ask them, have you been working with any other brokers? And if they say yes, you say, well, why have you stopped working with them? And they say, well, the guy was doing a terrible job. What I would then say is, have you written to them, have you given them written notice that there's no more agency relationship? Because I don't want to interfere with any kind of agency, so perhaps you want to clarify that, and I'd like to have a copy of that too, so that I can be kind of assured that I'm not going to get dragged into a procuring cause action.
So arbitration, John, first of all, we can't have an arbitration unless we have a deal. We have to have a deal. We have to have a closing. There has to be money at risk here.